Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 17 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have won 5-1. So not only are we treated to a rare San Jose Sharks victory here tonight, but also with their most goals that they have scored all season long. Only 3 times prior to this game did they even manage to hit the 3-goal mark, but here tonight they get 5 against a pretty decent St. Louis Blues team. This isn't some pushover squad. While the Blues are not necessarily going to be competing for a Stanley Cup this season, they very well could end up being a playoff team. They were in a playoff spot coming in to tonight's game, and so the Sharks put up a very strong effort. It will not end up being the first time this season in which the Sharks would outshoot their opponents, because due to the fact that the Sharks have the 5-goal lead heading into the third period, score effects come into play, and as such the Blues actually get more shots there and end up overwhelming San Jose and outshooting them by a few. But realistically, this was quite a strong game for San Jose, and they were for sure by far the better team here tonight, which is probably the first time that you can even say that thus far this season. And it starts off in the first period very, very well for the Sharks. They come out on fire. They don't even allow the Blues to get a shot on net or more than one shot on net through the first half of the first period, which is a massive change of pace to pretty much every other first period that they have played this season. Even the stronger first periods that the Sharks have previously had, they're usually still getting outshot 12-5. So the fact that they came out and they were really controlling the puck well was quite nice to see. And it amounted to a Mike Hoffman goal to make it 1-0 San Jose. The Blues would push near the end of the first period and begin to equalize on that shot counter, but Kaapo Kähkönen stood tall and kept the Sharks' 1-goal lead alive, just long enough to get to the second period, where the Sharks' offensive explosion, really their first time that they've even had sort of a sustained offensive zone time, allowed them to not only get a 2-goal lead, but then a 3 and then 4 and then even 5-goal lead shortly after. The first 3 goals, coming from Eklund, Smith, and Cunnin, all came in relatively quick succession to turn a 1-goal lead to a 4-goal lead just like that. And then Hoffman a few minutes later would make it the 5-goal lead that would suddenly make it extremely tough for the Blues to come back from. Of course, the Sharks have done some pretty historic things this season, so a 5-goal lead being blown is not exactly entirely out of the question. So come the third period, there was still definitely a reason to watch, but the Sharks controlled things decently well while they were giving up chances to the St. Louis Blues. Kähkönen played well, and they weren't giving up tons of great chances. However, with about 6 minutes left in the third period, it would finally be Buchnevich breaking through with a tip goal to make it 5-1 San Jose. And this is where we saw the fragility of the San Jose Sharks come into play, because after this Buchnevich goal, the Sharks send on their fourth line for the shift right after, and it is just absolutely an awful defensive zone shift for the Sharks players as a whole. It gave up multiple chances to the St. Louis Blues, and not because the Blues were just pushing and pressuring so hard and making these amazing plays, but the Sharks were just abandoning their defensive positioning time and time again on just this single shift. And the Sharks were extremely lucky to have not just given up a second goal immediately after. And who knows, at that point, with about 5 minutes left, just down 3 goals now, maybe the St. Louis Blues could have indeed made this historic comeback. But luckily for the Sharks, their goaltender is there, bails them out. The Sharks then send on their first line. It calms things down, and while they would end up taking a penalty in the last 3 minutes, which made things slightly dicey, by then there really wasn't enough time to close this gap. And indeed, the Sharks would finish up their best win of the season for sure with the 5-1 victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, we once again have this top line kept together yet again, and they just continue to generate that chemistry between them. There's so much sort of comfortability between these 3 players at this point. We saw that in the early parts of the third period with the tic-tac-toe play between Zetterlund, Hertl, and Eklund. Eklund robbed of getting his second goal of the game by Jordan Binnington. Otherwise, it would have been a beautiful goal for this top line, but they just continue to push in waves. They are generating offensive zone time, which is something that would have seemed impossible just 2-3 weeks ago for any line or any combination of forwards for the San Jose Sharks, the defense isn't still necessarily helping out in that regard. So it is up to the forwards to be able to cycle it well, and these three players are doing it amazingly. And when it comes in particular to Tomas Hertl, let's talk about him first. It wasn't a super dominant game in the classic Hertl fashion where he's creating that space, he's bullying people off pucks, and he's just able to force his way and force plays on net. But instead, what really shone through here for Hertl was just his skill with the puck. This is something that is easy to forget when it comes to Tomas Hertl, because you always imagine him as that big hulking player who can just push his way past players. But his original debut in the NHL over a decade ago was that at least his third game of his NHL career was that 4-goal performance against the New York Rangers, including that between the legs goal, the fourth one in that game. It showed that Hertl has an innate skill with the puck to be able to make those tight plays in tough situations, and we saw that multiple times here tonight with Hertl. Just a lot of finesse in this game, which was quite cool to see for him, because indeed a lot of the times with Hertl we're mostly seeing that sort of push people around play, but it's nice to see that skill level rise here tonight. When it comes to his two wingers, Eklund, who had a slightly shaky game in the previous one against the Florida Panthers, definitely redeems himself here tonight, played very, very well, gets a goal here, which was quite nice to see as he continues to begin to put up those points as the Sharks generally get slightly more comfortable with actually scoring goals, which is nice to see, and just set up a lot of really good ones here tonight. Like I said, could have had a second goal if not robbed by Binnington, probably could have had an assist here or there if there was a bit more finish on the rest of his line, but just generally a solid game for Eklund. Zetterlund as well fits in exactly like that. I have been very critical of Zetterlund in the past, not only last season where he was just a disaster with the Sharks, but also this season. I have not necessarily agreed with him being pushed up to the top 6, but I will admit at this point that I was wrong. He has developed a ton of chemistry with these two other players, and while he is still likely the shakiest player and the player who is most likely to be demoted from this line if things do begin to go south, at the moment that hasn't happened, and he's fitting in quite well here. When it comes to the second line, though, things aren't nearly as positive. So we had the return of Anthony Duclair here tonight, and so Cunnin, who had a pretty good game against the Florida Panthers, actually gets dropped down to the fourth line, though we'll get to him a bit later. Duclair inserted back immediately into the top 6. He was coming off of strep throat, as at least what is reported, so he missed 3 games, and it seemed as though he may have been very, very sick while not playing, because here tonight, he didn't look into it at all, did not look like the Anthony Duclair that we had been seeing in the few games prior to him stepping out of the lineup. It looks a lot more like the Anthony Duclair we were seeing through the first 3-4 games of the season, which is essentially just an invisible Anthony Duclair. He did very little here tonight, nothing positive for the San Jose Sharks, and so it was a bit disappointing to see, but I will give him a break because indeed, coming back from such a tough illness, I've had strep throat a couple of times, it's not pretty, and it seems as though from the reports that he had it maybe even worse than you might expect. It's definitely tough to readjust to the NHL speed, so again, give him a bit of a pass. The players who I will not necessarily give a pass to is, first of all here, Mikael Granlund, who again, not really doing much of anything here tonight. Perhaps you could say, well, Gushin is a pretty inexperienced forward. Duclair just seemed very out of it, so he didn't exactly have the best players to work with, which is definitely true, but still you're hoping to see a bit more from Granlund for sure, and it's just been a bit of a shaky last few games for him. And then finally, the last player on this line, Danil Gushin. Of course, the eyes still on him. He gets a second straight game after a pretty solid outing, the previous one against the Florida Panthers. And, there's some good news and bad news here when it comes to Danil Gushin. One of the big things when it comes to these young players that coaches are so critical of is their defensive play. It is difficult as a young player to really adjust to how skilled the players on the ice are and how they're able to just abuse the even slightest mistakes that you might make, something that doesn't happen at the junior level or even the AHL level. And so it's something that Gushin does need to be used to. But in this game, his defensive positioning was actually rather sound. He found himself in solid spots. He didn't exactly seem super lost on the ice. But the issue on the defensive side, I felt as though he just wasn't really aggressive and wasn't willing to engage in sort of battles with some of the opposing team's players. It felt as though he was just perfectly fine with finding himself in the correct position and then sort of just waiting for the puck to end up on his stick. It kind of reminded me of an Erik Karlsson style of defending, but slightly worse for sure, in that he's just not exactly pressuring as much. And as a younger forward, you kind of try to make your name for yourself on the ice by being that pest, by being under people's skin, not necessarily in a sort of physical penalty style of way, but just generally sort of, hey, like, I'm here on the ice, I'm a player who you're going to have to sort of get through, even if I'm not exactly the most physically imposing player. I would take a page out of William Eklund's book when it comes to how Daniil Gushchin should be trying to defend at the NHL level while being a sort of small-statured player. On the offensive side of things, where Gushchin is expected to shine, things weren't necessarily that much better. While he did have a couple of good looks in this game, it felt as though he was not reading the plays exceptionally well. There were a couple of times in this one where he had the opportunity to make a nice pass and just kind of went for one that was just completely not even well conceptualized. Sometimes you'll see a player go for a crazy cross-ice pass that, had it landed, it would have been an easy tap-in goal, but it ends up going through like 3 defenders, and so it gets picked off. This wasn't even necessarily the case with Gushchin. I believe it was a shift in the third period. He had the opportunity to make a very nice just back pass to Duclair, who would have had a lot of room to work with, but instead he goes for like a very low percentage cross-ice pass that would have perhaps hit Granlund if it somehow managed to make its way through like 2 or 3 Blues players, and then even if it had hit that Sharks forward on the other side, it wouldn't have even amounted to much of anything. So Gushchin definitely needs to be able to read the offensive plays a bit more. His defensive positioning is sound, but I'd like to see him challenge more, and this is the type of game that could perhaps get him pulled out of the lineup, because as we know, David Quinn is extremely critical of young forwards. Hopefully he does manage to maintain his spot, but I'm not so sure if it will happen. When it comes to the third line here, we have Zadina, Sturm, and Hoffman. Hoffman, of course, had already begun to pick it up with his previous performance the other game against the Florida Panthers, and here tonight he brings it home. A 2-goal performance for Mike Hoffman, which was quite nice to see. The first one finds himself some open ice off of a bad St. Louis Blues turnover. The second one, he gets that breakaway from a nice pass from Filip Zadina. So a good game for Mike Hoffman. The one strength of his game is his offense, and he wasn't proving that through the first dozen plus games of the season, but it's finally happening over these last couple of games, and he's finally a positive for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the other 2 players on this line, Zadina had a pretty solid game, I would say. A couple of very nice offensive zone situations, and while his defensive game could be somewhat suspect, I would say, here tonight, I think offensively he was a positive enough to have it be a good game for him. And then when it comes to Nico Sturm, not nearly as noticeable, I would say, as his 2 other line mates, but he sort of tied this line together well, I guess. And then, of course, we have the fourth line, and that brings us to Luke Kunin, who, as I mentioned, had a good game for the first time almost this season, it felt like, against the Florida Panthers, and his reward was actually getting dropped to the fourth line, but I felt as though this is a much better position for Luke Kunin, because on the second line, you get maybe a good game every like 5 or 6 games, but more often than not, he just looks out of place. But on the fourth line is an opportunity for him to shine against weaker competition. That's exactly what happens. He makes up a strong fourth line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, gets some very good chances, scores a goal in this one, now has 4 goals on the season, which is actually tied for the team lead, which is both impressive and also incredibly sad for the team as a whole, but still. And then when it comes to his 2 other line mates here tonight, Carpenter continues to be an actual effective bottom 6 player. I've mentioned this time and time again. The same thing continues, so he's the type of guy who you do kind of want to keep into the lineup at this point. And Giovanni Smith, who's had a bit of a roller coaster of a season but has been getting better, finally gets on the scoreboard thanks to that. A goal and an assist here tonight. So the fourth line was quite strong. They had that terrible shift after the Buchnevich goal, but that's really the only negative that I could really have for this line that was otherwise good. And when it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Emberson. I actually liked this pairing very much. I thought they were quite sound defensively. Didn't exactly do anything offensively, which is just a general theme with pretty much all of the Sharks defensemen the entirety of this season, so it kind of goes without saying in a way. But on the defensive side of things, I really liked Emberson. Ferraro was also quite solid, so just generally a good game for this first pairing. The second pairing was slightly worse, I would say. Addison as a player, I didn't exactly notice, which is sometimes a good thing when it comes to like defensive defensemen. If you don't really notice them, that usually means they don't stand out in a bad way, even if they're not necessarily standing out in a good way either. But the thing remains the case with Calen Addison. I've mentioned this literally every single game since he's come over from Minnesota, is that he was brought in to be an offensive force for the San Jose Sharks, not exactly as a Carlson replacement. Obviously, that's never going to happen, but to be at least like some offensive elements to this game, and that's just not happening at all here tonight. He was completely devoid of any sort of offensive capability, and so while his defensive game was okay, not great, but not terrible, you're looking for more for sure. When it comes to Jan Ruda, very similar in the sort of not noticing camp. There was like one or two kind of bad plays, I would say, so I wouldn't say this was a great game for Ruda, but I guess not terrible. And then when it comes to the third pairing, we saw the player who would step out of the lineup here tonight was actually Marc-Edouard Vlasic. I had originally thought it might be Okhotiuk because of the fact that he had so many bad turnovers in that Florida Panthers game, and because of the fact that I didn't think David Quinn would bench Vlasic again. But thankfully, the worst defenseman for the Sharks does sit out this game, and it is a duo of Burrows and Okhotiuk. Burrows, I thought, had a much better game than he has had recently in the past. He seemed much more into it, much more aggressive, clearing the front of the net, just doing a lot of the good things defensively. Okhotiuk, still a few issues from a turnover perspective. There were about 3 times this game where he had some really bad turnovers in the offensive zone, which is just something that absolutely cannot happen. Even though he was bailed out time and time again by Kaapo Kähkönen, it's just that's just not a way to actually win games. Outside of the turnovers, he was fine. He was actually pretty good, but those 3 turnovers are going to be the sort of stain on this otherwise solid game for him. So it's a question of whether or not he'll manage to maintain a lineup spot. I feel as though after a 5-1 win, you can't really change up the group unless like a crazy return from injury occurs, like a Logan Couture suddenly comes back, or perhaps even a Matt Benning. But you never know. And then finally, we get to the goaltender, Kaapo Kähkönen. So unlike Mackenzie Blackwood, who had been quite good thus far for the Sharks this season, Kähkönen has struggled at times a good amount for them. He hasn't been completely terrible, nor the worst player on the team like last season, but he certainly hasn't been good. He hasn't necessarily been doing many favors for the San Jose Sharks, but here tonight he was very, very good for sure. His best game of the season, if I had to say. Just incredible, making amazing saves on the St. Louis Blues players. He didn't exactly have to stand on his head. Like, this wasn't an absolutely stolen game, especially since the Sharks did score 5 goals. It's not as though if he had played just at an average level, the Sharks would have lost like 8-5 or anything like that. But he definitely made it so that this wasn't a really close like 5-5 kind of game, overtime 5-4 goaltender pulled in the last few seconds, because he made a lot of really nice saves. The shutout gets broken by Buchnevich tip in goal that he didn't really have much of a chance on, but otherwise very, very good. It makes it an interesting question of who will get the next start, because that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, so they'll get a few days off, and they'll face off against the Vancouver Canucks, a team that they have played once this season already, and they lost to 10-1. So it's going to be extremely difficult for the Sharks to do any worse than that, but the Canucks this season have been very, very good. We'll see if the Sharks can put up a fight. Class dismissed.